Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Ella and I'm delighted to be joined by Wallbridge and Alec McCauley, who will be talking to you about drive adoption of Office 365 groups and modern SharePoint sites. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC18. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is packed with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com/resource center. After the webinar, we will have a question and answer session. Type any questions you have for Sean and Alec in the question window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and will be added to the Resource Center, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar hosts, Sean and Alec. Hello, Sean and Alec, are you there?
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
It's very early here. Oh, you're muted. Oh, Ella, can you unmute Alec, please?
It says I'm muted by the organizer.
It says muted by the organizer.
It says self-muted.
Good morning. Yeah, no, I'm here now. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'll just get my screen shared here. As Sean said, it's it's exactly 6 in the morning here our time. Just to confirm, everybody can see the PowerPoint deck. Okay, cool. Awesome. Morning, folks. Thanks for joining us, or good afternoon if you're in Europe. We will be talking about, as Ella said, driving adoption of Office 365 groups and modern SharePoint sites, and we'll get started without further ado. I'll introduce my colleague, Sean Wallbridge, who's the principal and president of itgroove Consulting Services here in Victoria.
And I'll introduce Alec McCauley, who's our managing consultant and the driving force behind our day-to-day operations and our new product line. He's newer, faster, better, and more charming me.
So we're talking to you from Victoria, BC, out on the west coast of Canada, where itgroove is operating out of. Like any good Canadian IT company, our main office is out of a hockey arena, and we recently have a second space in the town just outside Victoria called Brentwood Bay, which is our itgroove studio space. itgroove was founded 15 years ago by Sean in his basement, and we're very happy he's graduated from that and put on pants. And we now have a team of about 15. It's a small boutique company, and as of last year, we launched a new division in the company called itgroove Studios, focused on cloud software as a service development in the Office 365 and Azure space. And we have our first product that went to market last February, called Masthead, which is focused on global navigation in SharePoint Online. That's enough about us, and we'll jump right in. So our topic today is all about how we drive adoption of modern SharePoint specifically, and all the pieces that come with that, the Office 365 groups ecosystem. And a big part of that is Microsoft has made huge investments in this, what's called SharePoint Modern user experience, and sort of new patterns and practices for SharePoint. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. The best way to leverage that investment is by paying attention to about 6 key focuses, which we'll get into and talk about within SharePoint Online, that will really let you take advantage of all the new functionality that's there and the investment that Microsoft has made in those user experiences.
So let's talk about the SharePoint journey. Where did it all begin? For me, it started, I think it was the Office XP CD and a little installer for Windows SharePoint services back long before the cloud was kind of a thing. So we used to install SharePoint, we used to plan it, roll it out, and often, more than not, customers would almost forget why they were implementing SharePoint by the time they finished installing it, from install to planning to roll out. By the time it went live, some of the stakeholders even changed. But that was the story for a long time. On-prem, 2007 to 2013 was building sites, storing files, doing workflows, and it was all pretty fantastic. But really, I think where things have really improved and where we're excited about is the whole SharePoint Online thing. So getting right down to it, we don't spend any time building farms anymore. We just immediately get to adding value. And even some of the things that have left SharePoint, the classic workflow experience being replaced by things like Flow, is a pretty exciting time. We're able to do more, we're able to do it faster, and we're able to do it at the same time that we're discussing it, versus tons of planning up front and hoping that it all works out in the end. So we're on the next part of that online journey, which is moving from the classic experience, publishing and lots of things that had a purpose a long time ago, and moving into the modern space, which is a lot more mobile focused, a lot easier to I don't know, move forward, and with the confidence that we're not migrating every 3-4 years as well. And I'll let Alec speak to where on-prem fits today.
Yeah, so I think for those who've been attending the Microsoft events, Microsoft still made it clear that there is a future for the on-premise version of the product. SharePoint 2019 will ship in the latter part of 2018. But I think what people have to understand is that the SharePoint product team that's delivering the on-premise version of the product is really a skeleton of what it once was. And their key focus is just kind of looking at the online space and figuring out what it's possible to bring back on-premise. So in SharePoint 2016, we've seen things in feature packs recently, such as the SharePoint framework web parts, and they've, some of the things we are talking about with modern today will come to 2019, but certainly not all of it. So I think there's still a real story there. Definitely Microsoft is focused on the hybrid piece as being a key part of that journey, knowing that not every organization can move absolutely everything to the cloud. But definitely for the purpose of today, our focus will be the cloud. And I'll try to point out from time to time which pieces will be coming back to the on-prem side of things. So we're going to get in next to, what exactly is this whole SharePoint modern thing, and where does that word come from? Microsoft 2 years ago, well, actually almost 3 now, began this journey of the SharePoint modern experiences. And what it was taking an old product that had been around and for a long time and built in very classic technology, ASP.NET web forms, which have been around since 2004, and rewriting the product almost from the ground up to take advantage of new modern web technologies. And that meant mainly on the front end, looking at technologies like React.js, client-side development, looking at what the rest of the world was doing in the web development space and bringing some of that back to SharePoint. It's, as a result, aligned the product sort of much better with what people are used to from a online platform. And definitely from our experience in the field, has made sort of driving adoption a lot easier than some of the SharePoint Classic experiences. To be clear, it's not a new version of the product. SharePoint Classic, as they're calling it in the online world, is still there. That's the experience you're used to from SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint 2016. This is a new experience that's been built alongside, and we'll talk about that migration path and what that looks like. And you've probably noticed that sort of these pieces are rolling out in some of your sites, or if you're creating new sites, sort of have that whole net new experience. So it's not a whole new product, still the same product. The base is still there. For those on the development side, the APIs are still there. The foundation is still the same. But definitely from the user experience side, it's not just a modification, it's a complete rewrite and change in technology. So with SharePoint Modern, we've got a new list and library experience. We've got modern pages, modern sites, and we'll talk a little bit about site provisioning in a second, but Microsoft has moved away from all the templates they used to have and gone to sort of 2 types of sites, team sites and communication sites, both of which are slick and serve a really nice purpose. The SharePoint framework for development, which we'll get into. SharePoint Online News, which has great tie-ins into the mobile apps and a number of the different experiences. Site designs for sort of creating pre-packaged sites, hub sites, which we'll talk about in the architecture and where they fit in, modern site provisioning to be able to spin up sites on demand, and then sort of the tools that surround it. Power Apps, Flow. Flow definitely, as Sean alluded to, replacing the workflow engine. Power Apps replacing the kind of the forms story. The SharePoint mobile app, which if you're looking at rolling out these experiences in sort of a modern workplace, definitely a key part of the story there. And new search experience unified across all of Office 365 and sort of taking the power of SharePoint search to that whole next level and giving people that Google-like search that they've always wanted. And last but not least, sort of integration with Microsoft Teams, which we'll touch on. So I want to touch too, as we go through this, sort of where the Office 365 groups piece fit. I know there's a lot of confusion whenever we go into the field and talk to people about, you know, what's a group, what's a site, when do I create a group, when do I create a site? And I think it's important to take a step back and understand from an Office 365 perspective, not just a SharePoint perspective, where groups fit in that story. Groups were created out of the necessity to create consistent collaboration spaces across all the products. And what I mean by that is when Microsoft first created Office 365, or even before that, when it was BPOS, Business Productivity Online Suite, really what it was a collection of products. It was SharePoint, it was Exchange, it was Lync back then, amongst others. And as the products first came online, that made sense because it was just sort of a one-to-one of what they were on premise. However, as those products started to evolve and change and actually take advantage of the potential offered in that online space, the challenge that Microsoft faced is that each one of those products had their own sort of quote unquote spaces. SharePoint had sites, Exchange had shared mailboxes, et cetera, et cetera. And the challenge that they need to do is figure out how do we create a unified space that exists across those products so that we don't have to worry about architecture in every single one of them. We can do that in a unified way. And that's where groups really came from. It was the idea that you create an Office 365 group centrally, and then from there, you've now spawned a space in each one of your tools. So if you need to publish BI from Power BI, you now have a space to do so. If you want to use Planner, you now have a space to do so. And they actually have created a really nice consistency across the products. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion about how to roll them out. Part of that comes down to, I think, some decisions that Microsoft made early on about how much Office 365 groups were exposed to end users, about how, you know, by taking actions in any of the products behind the scenes, you were creating groups. And often what happens if the governance of the groups piece isn't done properly up front, you wind up just with a huge, massive groups that's really difficult to sort of clean up later. And as it relates to SharePoint, that's sort of the key piece. Because if you're creating SharePoint team sites behind the scenes, you're actually creating Office 365 groups. There's a one-to-one linkage there. And what we're going to propose and talk about as we get into the architecture of this presentation is that really you want to look after the Office 365 groups piece first. You want to create your groups, think about how that's going to be structured, how that works holistically across Office 365, and then build SharePoint on top of that. The challenge becomes if you just focus only on SharePoint, you're gonna have trouble when you try to roll out other parts of Office 365 later. So it really has to be that holistic look and that holistic approach. I just want to recognize SharePoint, where I took this graphic from. The blog post I've got linked to there, which will be in the deck when we share it, is a fantastic resource if you're looking to learn more about Office 365 groups. I want to touch quickly on some of the announcements from the most recent up until the European conference, the most recent SharePoint conference, which was SharePoint Conference North America, and some of the announcements we saw there. Following Microsoft's sort of cycle from the last 3-4 years, we get a slew of announcements in May. It used to be at their virtual event. Now it's at the SharePoint conference, which they've brought back in Las Vegas. And then sort of from there, sort of around this time of summer, those things that have been announced start going into preview, and then they're usually GA, general availability for Ignite in the fall. So we're right in the kind of midst of that development cycle that we normally see, and there should be some nice new things coming as we go here. One of those things is organizational news. For those of you who've been using SharePoint Modern and the sort of the new online SharePoint sites, you'll have seen SharePoint News itself, which is quite powerful. It's the ability for sites, people on sites to post news to those sites, and then have that news roll up to the SharePoint dashboard. If you're using hub sites, it rolls up to the hub site, and also to the SharePoint mobile app. What we've seen in the field, certainly what people have been asking for, is there needs to be some curation of that. There needs to be the ability to say, hey, we want, this news story from the CEO to show up more prominently than the announcement from accounts payable saying to get your receipts in, which doesn't exist today. It's purely just by date. So organization news is coming. It'll give you some better curation, better targeting of news stories by region, by audience, all those things, as well as integration with Microsoft Teams. There will be an actual SharePoint news tab as well to add to your team. More search customizations. So for those of you who've played with the new Office 365 search experiences, they're really slick, but we've lost some of the power we had with SharePoint Enterprise Search, where we could do things like custom filtering and refining and search suggestions and all those different pieces. That's coming back. They made that clear, but they're bringing all that power into the new Office 365 search experience, and those two things combined together are going to give us a pretty powerful tool set. For those of you who've been using modern lists and libraries, you'll know at this point there's no sort of list templating like we used to have in the classic versions, where you could actually save a list as a template. And what they're doing to replace that is when you go to create a new list or library, you'll be able to actually either say create net new or pick from an existing list or library on any site to use as kind of a starting point. There'll also be a new quick edit experience, which for those of you who've used the modern list and libraries will know if you click on quick edit right now, it just still loads the old quick edit, which works well in Internet Explorer, but really not anywhere else, and not necessarily very slickly. The new quick edit I've seen and actually had a chance to play with, and it's really fantastic. It really does feel like you're working in Excel, even to the extent that you can copy and paste data into your list from Excel, almost like a native spreadsheet. Real-time lists and libraries. This is just right now, if you're working in a list and somebody else is working in there with you or in a library, you need to actually refresh those pages to see changes. With real-time lists and libraries, those changes will be happening automatically without reloading the page. For those of you who've played with the SharePoint framework web parts, which have been out for quite a while and definitely we'll touch on in a future part of our presentation here, there's now the ability to add those as tabs in Teams, which is very, very powerful to be able to sort of do Teams development and SharePoint development all in one. And I think it speaks to the fact that the SharePoint framework is being adopted far beyond SharePoint in the Office 365 space. Site designs and site scripts I won't touch on too much here because we will be have a whole section talking about them. But this is the ability to actually provision sites sort of from a template in a very different way than we used to have to deal with it. SharePoint Spaces, which is a new piece that's coming out from Microsoft, just in its early stages, but was announced at the conference. I won't touch on this too much. Feel free to Google it if you want some more background, but this is all to do with augmented reality and where Microsoft's vision is for SharePoint as we move into not just the modern workplace, but kind of the next step for the workplace in the VR and augmented reality space. And from the demos, they did, there's some pretty cool potential coming here. So with all that, those kind of just being a smattering of announcements, some of them will make a lot more sense once you've got the context of the next piece we're going through. We're going to focus in on 6 key focuses to drive adoption. So taking care of architecture and governance first and foremost, taking care of site provisioning, how you can actually easily create sites and make sure that your sites are created in a consistent way. How you can look after your user experience and the customizations that you need to do. Collaboration amongst your teams, lists and data, and migrations. And as we go through all those, that should give you a pretty comprehensive view of the new SharePoint story in the modern spaces. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. So we're going to start talking about architecture and governance first and foremost. And like I said before, the biggest key takeaway to start with is that we need to think beyond SharePoint. When we were doing SharePoint on-premise, we created site collections, we created sites, and that really was the end of the story. In Office 365 and SharePoint Online and SharePoint Modern, it's just the very beginning of the story. SharePoint, by its nature, tends to be one of the first products rolled out from Office 365. Organizations are looking to get, they're looking to retire servers, looking to new versions of SharePoint, and Exchange and SharePoint tend to be the first two products that get rolled out online. But the reality is that there's so much more waiting for you there. There's Planner, there's Power BI, there's Teams, there's all the different tools that Microsoft has built. If you're really excited about Sway, that's waiting for you there too. I'm not so excited about Sway, but it is there. And to be successful in implementing and seeing adoption of all those tools, the biggest thing is that when people go into those spaces to work, they need to be able to choose logical groupings to work from. So if I go into Planner and my organization hasn't thought through its Office 365 group structure, I am going to have no idea what to do, because there's going to be a million plans showed to me, because plans correspond to a group, and those plans aren't going to make any sense. If I go in to start working with teams and groups haven't been thought through, I might create a Microsoft team, which creates a group behind the scenes, and I'm going to call it finance, let's say. But maybe there's already a SharePoint site that existed for finance, and now we have two finance groups that aren't connected in any way, one of which is storing all my SharePoint data, one of which is connected to Teams. But the whole point of Teams and all these other tools is that at the end of the day, all roads lead back to SharePoint, and the data from those tools is being stored back to SharePoint. So we need to really make sure that we think through that story. What that comes down to is taking a step back, planning out your sort of org structure, thinking through how you're going to use Office 365, and before you start creating SharePoint sites, creating those Office 365 groups. You can create them as sites. If you create a SharePoint site, you're going to get a group behind the scenes. What I would strongly suggest doing, though, is actually creating them from the Office 365 admin center as groups and managing everything kind of through that Active Directory side of things. It's what we always wanted to do with SharePoint. We never wanted to give people explicit permissions to SharePoint. We wanted to use Active Directory groups as much as possible. Same thing here. If you do that all through Active Directory and it's all managed through groups, you never have to deal with managing SharePoint permissions. In the modern experience, that those permission pages have been really buried. You have to click through advanced settings a number of times. And the reason for that is that if you are managing permissions from the group level, which is the first thing that SharePoint exposes to you, you'll have a really, really slick experience, and it'll transcend far beyond SharePoint. So we've had a huge amount of success in small to mid-sized to large organizations rolling out SharePoint and Office 365 by starting with that group story. On the SharePoint side, and what I've got up on screen right now is, on top of that, like there's always been, there's still sort of three main considerations we have to think about when we're rolling out SharePoint. The first is navigation. So how are our users going to find something? SharePoint does a very good job of navigation within sites and now within hub sites, which we'll talk about in a second, but they do a poor job of navigating globally across sites. And it often leads to a huge adoption hurdle, because people have this sort of disjointed collection of sites where they don't quite understand how to move between, and they can't find what they're looking for. We need to give users that kind of hierarchy, that navigation structure that they crave from a web platform and a web tool. And a good way of doing that is through doing some sort of global navigation, or at least sort of giving consideration to how you're going to put the pieces together. We need to give some consideration to where things sit technically, so how we're going to break up our sites. One really important thing to know in SharePoint Modern is that subsites are no longer a viable path. It's been talked about for a long time by Microsoft that so they were easing away from the subsite story, even starting in SharePoint 2013, because of all the challenges they posed around feature inheritance, permissions, all those different things. Microsoft really encouraged us to go to a flat structure where everything was sites and site collections. That's been really reinforced in SharePoint Online, to the point where if you create a modern site, you technically still can create a subsite, but it's going to revert it right away back to a SharePoint Classic site as soon as you do so. A big part of this is that because those sites have a one-to-one relationship with Office 365 groups, subsites doesn't fit into that story, and people won't be able to access those subsites through all the apps and integrations that Microsoft has, which are really nice. If I go to save something in Office 2016 now, I can pick a site in 2 seconds and dive into a document library. I won't be able to do that for subsites. Site architecture matters from the point of view of how we do permissioning. As I said, they're tied to the groups. We want to do those permissions at the group level and having that one-to-one relationship to be able to look after that is key. So you want to think about how your groups are structured, how your sites are structured, so that we can look after where things sit technically, how they're permissioned, and even going as far as, if we had to do a restore scenario through Microsoft support, what would that look like? We definitely don't want everything in kind of one site. And then where does it sit in the taxonomy? So this is information management, thinking about how we're going to use metadata to, to tag our documents. All that reality of SharePoint isn't gone. That's all still there. We need to give consideration to how we know what the content is that we have, how we're going to be able to find it. What that really translates to is if you think about it as navigation is, how are we going to find it today? If I'm looking for something, I'm probably going to drill through the navigation and drop down to the site that I know what I'm looking for. From a site collection, architecture is about how is it stored? Where is that file physically sitting in our SharePoint SharePoint setup? And then last but not least, from the information management side is, how are we going to find this 5 years from now? So hub sites, I talked a lot about how subsites are no longer kind of a viable part of the SharePoint story. Hub sites is Microsoft's not replacement for them, but they're architectural consideration to help us solve that problem. People want that hierarchy, like I talked about. They want to be able to drill down through sites and sort of find what they're looking for, and hub sites gives us that capability. What you do is you actually convert a modern site into a hub site, and then you can attach other sites to it. So you're attaching things to hubs. What it lets you do is it lets you roll up content to the hub homepage, like news and events, gives you consistent navigation across all the sites in the hub site. Behind the scenes, it creates a scoped search. And you can also run site scripts, which we'll talk about in a second, behind the scenes to take action when sites are connected to the hub. So a key way that we use these is we will create hub sites for divisions in an organization. So, and then have departments attached to them, or we'll create a hub site for the intranet and then attach all of the communication sites that make up the intranet to the hub. We'll create a project site hub and attach all the project sites. It lets you kind of give some classification and structure to your SharePoint taxonomy. One thing to avoid doing, because I've seen people do it a lot, is create one hub site for your organization and attach every site to it just so that you get the global navigation. It defeats the entire purpose, and it's not how it was designed to be used. And it kind of works counter to what you're trying to do. You can create up to 50 hub sites, 50, in your organization. Everybody's kind of expecting that number to go up because larger organizations are saying that that's nowhere near enough, and that's certainly what we've seen. You could easily have 50 divisions in a multinational company.
Okay, so let's talk about site provisioning. We used to create lots of SharePoint sites, and we used to create them from SharePoint. The reality is, these days we do that a lot less frequently. Actually, we're creating sites out of teams. We're getting sites created because we decide to explore Planner. There's still lots of opportunities to create sites and create them well. And the tooling today is vastly improved. No longer are we saving a site as a template and then reusing that template, and typically finding that our approach and desires for those templates have changed over time. So if we instead move to automating site creation and creating scripts, we can actually repurpose some of that tooling as well to go back and visit sites that need those additional components. As far as when we do provision sites, there's a couple of scenarios. One is still the idea of a project site, but also extranet sites, which ultimately could be project sites as well. SharePoint Online with Azure means everything can be an extranet, and it can be easier than it used to be. No longer are we poking holes in firewalls. We're actually creating sites and interacting with people on the outside, and we want to give them a comprehensive and cohesive experience every single time with consistency in place. So nowadays when we're templating, we're actually using modern provisioning capabilities and doing it at the click of a button in the SharePoint admin interface. And I'll let Alec talk about the journey.
Yeah, and this really fits into the DevOps model that a lot of organizations are embracing across the board, where we want to automate and do things programmatically as much as possible. It gives us better control and better consistency and ultimately better governance. So First off, I definitely stole this slide. As you can see, it's actually just a photo of the slide from Vesa. Vesa is a huge part of the SharePoint community on the Microsoft side and leads the PNP team, patterns and practices. And we're all very thankful for the resources he creates for us every day. And this was from a presentation of his from the SharePoint conference. So going from a scale that he likes to use of evil to flowers and butterflies, there's a number of different ways that we can provision sites. And this is the reality with everything in SharePoint as the modern experiences have evolved. Now that we've gone through, realistically coming up on almost 18 years of the product, 15 years, I guess, there's a lot of ways out there that you can do things. Some of them are still supported, some are not. And it's really matter of focusing on, what's the best pattern to achieve what we're trying to achieve. And that's what I'm going to try to give you as much context on as possible in the modern pieces. So on the evil side of things, definitely site definitions. If you're still using those, that was the old piece of, actually changing the XML of what a site looked like and creating a definition. That's been gone for a long time. So hopefully nobody is still doing that. Definitely not even supported in the online space. Site templates is one that I see and use still a ton, and definitely it is on that evil side. You cannot export modern sites as templates, and it's always caused a lot of grief around publishing, around all kinds of other features. The templates tend to stop working after a while, especially in the online space where the product is constantly evolving. The templates, were a point in time snapshot. And the whole point of what we want to do in modern, which we'll talk about throughout this presentation, is keep yourself on rails with Microsoft so that you're moving forward as they roll out their changes. Templating definitely breaks that, along with causing a whole bunch of other issues. I've seen people who have figured out that the site template export URL is still available behind the scenes and are exporting stuff. Please don't do that. It will just cause you grief. On that similar subject, web templates are at least a little bit better than site templates, but still have their whole slew of issues. Feature framework was, the way that we were going in 2010. That was the ability to programmatically create features, staple them so that when a site created, the features were activated, and then deploy a whole bunch of lists and libraries. Definitely declarative features, so using XML to provision stuff is still supported in online. Obviously, we can't do full trust code in online. And on-premise, you still can do that full trust code, but hopefully there are better ways of doing this now. If you are on-premise, this might still be slightly more viable. Definitely in the online space, it's not really a good option. Remote provisioning is out of the Microsoft Patterns and Practices team. It uses a series of PowerShell command lists that have been developed by the PNP team to go and basically take a snapshot of a site and then create that site net new, and allows you to do a whole bunch of programmatic configuration of that along the way. And is very, very powerful for doing programmatic provisioning, but it is definitely more development heavy and more complex. Still a very good option if you have really advanced requirements. The one that we're going to talk about the most today, and the newest that works with modern sites, is site designs and site scripts. And that's the ability to really automatedly create and configure sort of packages for your sites that will get deployed out. There's still some limitations to what you can do with that. We'll talk about ways around those limitations, but definitely falling back to remote provisioning is always an option as well. But hopefully you're up in those top two sort of categories there. So how does site designs and site scripts work? Basically, you can create your site scripts and attach them to site designs, which we'll show in a demo in a second. And then when you go into the new modern create site experience, you will actually see that site design available to pick from. Behind the scenes, those site scripts, you'll see an example in a second, but they are just JSON files, and you're declaring actions within those JSON files. And there's a whole lot of them available today, and there's more and more being added all the time. Ultimately, if you hit something that you cannot do yet in a site script, you can trigger it a flow and then use the flow to trigger an Azure function, which we do a lot. And then from that Azure function, the sky's the limit, because you can just talk to the SharePoint REST API and do whatever you need to do. So this is on the right here is just a sort of a sample of what's available. There's a whole Microsoft SharePoint support page about this where they list all the actions and give you the schema. And then, like we talked about, there's still that PNP provisioning engine, more advanced, more complex, but definitely a lot of power there still too if you need to do really dynamic site creation. As Sean touched on, these are things like, you want to have a project site with a specific set of lists and libraries and web parts and configurations you want to easily deploy. There's a governance aspect here too, which is really nice in the modern site provisioning, which is that you can declare security groups and say, only people in this security group can create this type of site. So maybe your project management office can create project sites, but nothing else, and have some good control through that approach. Bear with me here. We're going to switch over to a video and go through a quick demo of site designs and site scripts. So I'll just switch over screens.
Okay, this is what a site script looks like. As you can see, it's a JSON file with a list of actions. In this example, we're going to apply a theme, set the site logo, and create a list. So with the file ready, we're going to run the add SPO site script commandlet, and we'll receive a site script ID. So I'll go ahead and copy that. Now we're going to create our site design. And this is where I'll paste that site script ID we just copied. Now we're going to run a snippet of PowerShell, and our site design called itgroove demo site will be created. So now we open up the SharePoint homepage and choose Create Site. Our site design was for a communication site, so we'll be choosing that option. So we'll pick our site choice, and as you'll see, there's a thumbnail that lets us know we've got the right one selected. We're going to give it a site name, click Finish, and off we go. A panel is going to pop out the side here. There it is. And it's going to be showing all the various things that are taking place. One thing to note, there's a total of 30 actions that you can do right now. So if you need to be doing more than that, you're probably going to want to look at using Flow and Azure functions to get more out of it. But as you can see, we now have a site that has our theme, our logo, and it's actually provisioned a list in the background that we'll be looking at later.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. Let's move on to our next key focus, which is really around user experience and customizations. So taking sort of out of the box SharePoint to the next level.
Oops, that's mute button is green is good. So let's stop trying to make SharePoint not look like SharePoint. We've heard that phrase for a long time, and Microsoft's actually working pretty hard to enforce that now. The term being on Rails is a big part of moving forward. So let's let the tooling look like the tooling, but still apply our corporate brand and look and feel to our sites. Now we want to be using application customizers to basically inject the UI elements into our sites, and instead of basing these on templates, we're going to employ web parts for adding functionality to pages or for building our apps. And let's use SharePoint for what it does best as an application front end, while using Azure for a lot of the components in the background. Now let's use the right tool from the toolkit.
And that kind of ties in with Microsoft's direction too, which is, whenever possible, from a development perspective, we want to be using the Microsoft Graph. We want to be bringing data from other parts of the Office 365 space. And what those last couple of points refer to is, we used to build full-on line of business systems within SharePoint. Maybe SharePoint was your expense system or something like that. You can still do a lot of that in SharePoint and leverage its power for storing documents. But for doing really big relational pieces and all that, build your backends properly. Use a database in Azure, use an API that you build in Azure Functions are an amazing dev tool. You can easily spin up sort of small bits of microservice code and then expose that through SharePoint. Still give people that really slick experience, save yourself from having to create apps from scratch where you have to create all the Chrome and all the pieces. Focus on the development that you need to do, leverage the power of what SharePoint gives you, and then be able to sort of extend that application from there. So in that modern approach, we're going to have the ability to define custom themes and make them available to site owners. This comes back to that user experience piece. So as Sean said, we don't want to, pretend that SharePoint isn't SharePoint. We want to just be transparent that, we're using SharePoint, let our users know, gives them the ability to find resources online and learn from those resources. That doesn't mean we can't put that sort of corporate branding, corporate look and feel piece into SharePoint. We've had really good success working with SharePoint, working with corporate design and communication teams, and sort of giving them that best of both worlds, where it still gives that brand and that gloss that they're looking for. And Microsoft's made that really powerful in the modern space. We'll show you a demo of site themes in a second. There's an online theme generator tool for you to be able to easily provision out those themes. One of the big things is just controlling which themes is available to who. So you can use security groups again and say, this theme's available to this person, not available to this person. You can hide the default themes, which are huge, so that people are picking from the corporate branding. Like you saw in our demo of site designs and site scripts, you can actually provision sites with a theme turned on. Using hub sites, you can enforce the themes, all the sites join to the hub site. So we've finally got some really good UI, UX control over our sites to enforce consistency. One note is that modern sites are still compatible with classic themes. If you're using classic themes, there would be some big limitations. Sean touched on application customizers, which we'll talk about in the SharePoint framework section, but definitely to make it really, really clear, master pages are no longer part of the SharePoint online story in modern SharePoint. Microsoft has moved away from ASP.NET. They're using React.js for all their user experiences. And even in the classic sites, their guidances for a long time has been, do not customize the master page in SharePoint online. Changes come along. They're doing, I think the conference said they're doing up to 20 deployments a day to SharePoint online, which means that if you're customizing that master page, you've now frozen your site in time and you're no longer receiving a lot of those sort of pieces. Best case scenario, it means your site is going to look more and more and more archaic. Worst case scenario is that there's going to be a breaking change to that master page that you're using. You're going to come in one morning and your site's not going to be able to load. So on the navigation side of the story, which is the other piece where we always get questions around customization, I've got a few options. You got your hub site navigation. Site navigation, right now the way it works is if you create a modern team site, you get left navigation. If you create a communication site, you get top navigation. That's going to change going forward so that you'll be able to actually pick what side you want your navigation on. And then there's this global navigation part to the story. And that's where I want to touch on a little bit, because from an adoption perspective, this is the part that makes a huge difference. So if we look at an Office 365, this is the communication site with the top navigation. The very top bar obviously is your suite bar. So that's the bar that transcends all the Office 365 products. Next down from there, in our example we're using here, this is actually our masthead product. This is our version of global navigation. There's lots of ways you can create this. You can do it, there's a custom development wise. There's different products on the market. We think we sort of come up with a really neat solution that works well across the board in both SharePoint Modern and SharePoint Classic. Beneath masthead there, that's your hub site navigation. And then one down from that is your site nav. Obviously, that's a lot of navigation, not saying you always need to have all those different layers turned on, but this actually has been working quite well for us on a lot of sites. Global nav lets you jump to the big building blocks of your intranet or your portal. Your hub site navigation lets you navigate maybe within your division. And then your site navigation obviously lets you navigate the current site that you're on. And we've been quite, had good success with adoption with that. It makes sense to users. Just to show you that same example in a team site, same kind of concept, except obviously your site nav's on the right. I'm gonna switch over here and Sean's gonna do a really quick demo of site themes and how those can be applied. Just give me 1 second to switch over screens here.
Okay, so Microsoft has provided us with a great new theme generator, and we're going to use this to pick the primary theme color. In this case, we'll call this Wallbridge Condo Teal, my wife's favorite color. Half our house is this color. We're going to grab the PowerShell for it. You notice we can also generate it as JSON and SAS as well. So with that selected, we're going to update our PowerShell script here so that we can run the add SPO theme commandlet with this, this PowerShell. So we're going to run that. And with that run, we're going to open up our SharePoint site. We're going to choose change the look. And we're going to pick our new theme from the list. Now, you can see there's a whole bunch of themes in there, and really, we probably want to limit our choices to just what our organization wants. So we can actually run the set SPO hide default themes commandlet. And at that point, all that we're going to have left are the themes that we actually want our organization to be using. And this definitely helps with confusion and ensures consistency. So we'll apply that bad boy. And the Wendy Condo Teal is here.
Awesome. Just one note too. So on the theme there that Sean showed, we're changing the colors. Microsoft's adding more and more to their theming capability all the time. You're gonna have control over the top banner pretty soon, as well as more control over accents and a few other pieces and how headers are displayed. The other big thing that's coming is the ability to change the font. So they're definitely listening to feedback from the community about what we want to be able to change. It is a shift from the days of, we can just bash apart the entire user experience and make it whatever we want it to be. You can still use application customizers to sort of put your user interface elements that you need into a series of defined placeholders on the page. But I strongly recommend sort of sticking to theming as much as possible. It definitely will keep you on the Rails approach for sticking with Microsoft changes. Moving up sort of the customization ladder from that, the next thing we deal with all the time is, we need to now create something custom. What's there out of the box doesn't work for us, we need more. And that's where the SharePoint framework comes in. SharePoint framework is really cool because for the first time, Microsoft has actually given us the ability to use the same framework that their developers are using. And what I mean by that is that in SharePoint Classic, and in all the previous versions of SharePoint, Microsoft would build the product, and then on top of it, they would create a developer framework, and they would hand that to us. That took different forms. We saw a lot of XSLT in SharePoint 2010. We saw a lot of JS Link and sort of CSR stuff in SharePoint 2013, display templates. But the reality is that Microsoft, for the most part, wasn't actually using those frameworks themselves. They were giving them to us as third-party developers. Now, the SharePoint modern experiences are built in the SharePoint framework. There is parity between what the tool set that they are using, the tool set that we're using, which means that we now are sort of one unified dev community, for lack of a better word. Couple that with Microsoft's embracing of open source technologies, and we've got something really powerful. If you have an issue with the SharePoint framework, or if you're having struggles with it, post to the Microsoft SharePoint framework GitHub. They will respond. They review those issues all the time internally, and they take them very seriously. And you will get great feedback and great results from going down those channels, and you'll see real engagement from the team and from the community. So there's some pretty amazing and incredible stuff happening in the SharePoint dev space. On one hand, it's never been easier to be a SharePoint developer because now we're just using standard web technologies, mainly React.js, Node.js, all the client-side pieces. So it's like, from our point of view as a dev team, we can onboard new developers very easily, even if they don't know SharePoint. And it's also a time when we actually now have this true sort of true collaboration across the community. So, like I talked about, SharePoint framework is entirely client-side. If you haven't learned React.js or a JavaScript library, it's a good time to do so. There are three sort of flavors out there right now. There's the React version, there's an Angular version, and there's just sort of a pure native version. My suggestion is to use the React version unless you have a strong reason not to. It's the version that Microsoft is using. The other ones are truly community supported. I think you want to use the one that